There's a particular kind of silence that absolute terror breeds. It is not the silence of peace, nor the quiet of contemplation. It is a brittle, watchful stillness, where every courtier, every senator, every servant holds their breath, listening for the footsteps of the monster who wears the imperial purple. In the sprawling, marble-clad corridors of the Palatine Palace in the late 30s of the 1st century, this silence was the background music to a reign of horrors. Men who commanded legions, who traced their ancestry back to the founding of Rome itself, would flinch when the emperor's gaze fell upon them. They knew that a misplaced word, a glance held too long, or even a perceived slight in a dream could mean confiscation, exile, torture, or a command to fall upon their own swords. The emperor was a young man, not yet 30, but his cruelty was ancient and inventive, a grotesque spectacle that seemed to spring from the darkest pits of a human soul. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but history would remember him by the chillingly innocent nickname his father's soldiers had given him as a child, Caligula, the Little Boot. How does a man become a monster? How does the celebrated son of a national hero, a youth welcomed to the throne with a joy and relief unparalleled in Roman history, transform into a tyrant whose name would become a byword for capricious sadism and deranged depravity? Was it a sudden madness, a fever that boiled away his reason and left only a husk of malevolent impulse? Or was the poison already there, seated in a childhood steeped in trauma and fear, nurtured in the venomous cord of his predecessor, waiting only for the sunlight of absolute power to bloom into its full, monstrous form? To understand the reign of Caligula is to undertake a grim journey into the pathology of power, to witness the systematic dismantling of a man's psyche and, with it, the moral fabric of an empire. This is not simply a story of a bad emperor. It is the story of how Rome's greatest hope became its most profound nightmare, a cautionary tale written in blood and terror that echoes through the centuries. To comprehend the darkness that would consume Caligula, one must first understand the light from which he sprang. He was born in 12 AD, not in the marble halls of Rome, but in a military camp on the rugged German frontier. His father was Germanicus, a man who embodied every Roman ideal. He was a brilliant general, handsome, charismatic, a nephew and adopted son of the sitting emperor, Tiberius. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of the divine Augustus himself, a woman of formidable will and unimpeachable lineage. Caligula was, by birth, the scion of Rome's two most powerful families, the Julians and the Claudians. As a toddler, he was the mascot of his father's legions. The soldiers, captivated by the sight of the little boy toddling around the camp in a miniature military uniform, complete with tiny hobnailed sandals, or caligae, affectionately nicknamed him Caligula. It was a name of love and fondness, a symbol of his connection to the common soldier and the legacy of his heroic father. This idyllic, martial childhood was shattered in 19 AD. Germanicus, after a spectacular tour of the eastern provinces, died suddenly and mysteriously in Antioch. On his deathbed, he was convinced he had been poisoned, and he whispered his suspicions to Agrippina, implicating Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria and a known rival appointed by Tiberius. The death of Germanicus plunged the empire into mourning. His ashes were brought back to Rome, and the procession was met by crowds of wailing citizens. For young Caligula, just 7 years old, this was the first great trauma, the loss of his idolized father and the introduction of a sinister, invisible threat that emanated from the very heart of the imperial court. Agrippina, fierce and unyielding, became a figure of opposition, openly accusing Tiberius of orchestrating her husband's murder. This set the family on a collision course with the aging, increasingly paranoid emperor. The years that followed were a slow, grinding crucible of fear and loss for the boy. He watched as Tiberius, influenced by the malign Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, began to systematically dismantle his family. His older brothers, Nero and Drusus, were declared enemies of the state on trumped-up charges. They were arrested, exiled to desolate islands, and starved to death in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. His mother, Agrippina, met a similar fate, exiled to Pandateria, where she was beaten so severely she lost an eye, eventually refusing food and starving herself to death. Young Caligula, a mere teenager, was powerless, shuffled between the care of his great-grandmother Livia and his grandmother Antonia. He learned a vital, terrifying lesson: to show ambition, to display pride, to even hint at the public's love for his family was a death sentence. He learned to dissemble, to hide his thoughts behind an impassive mask, to erase his personality. He was surviving, but the psychological cost was immense. In 31 AD, at the age of 19, the summons came. Tiberius, now ruling in self-imposed exile from his island fortress of Capri, a place that was becoming legendary for its isolation and debauchery, called for his last surviving grandnephew. For 6 years, Caligula lived as a virtual prisoner in this viper's nest. Capri under Tiberius was a laboratory of psychological torment. The emperor, old and embittered, surrounded himself with astrologers, sycophants, and instruments of his perversions. It was a place of constant suspicion, where spies reported every word and informants grew rich on the downfall of others. Here, Caligula perfected the art of survival. The historian Suetonius wrote that he was a consummate actor, carefully studying Tiberius's moods, echoing his sentiments, and showing no reaction to the news of his mother's and brother's deaths. He was, as one observer noted, the best of servants and the worst of masters. He submerged his grief and his rage beneath a placid surface of sycophancy. But what did he witness on that island? He saw absolute power untethered from responsibility. He saw cruelty as a form of entertainment. He saw sexual license that defied every Roman taboo. He was breathing in the very poison that had destroyed his family, learning the grammar of tyranny from its greatest living practitioner. When Tiberius finally died in March of 37 AD, the news was greeted with savage joy in Rome. The people, who despised the old emperor, poured into the streets chanting, "Tiberius to the Tiber," and their gaze turned to the sole survivor of the beloved Germanicus's line. Caligula's accession was not just a political transition, it was a national catharsis. At 24 years old, he was the embodiment of hope. He was young, descended from Augustus and Germanicus, and seemed to be the very antithesis of the gloomy, reclusive Tiberius. His journey from Capri to Rome was a triumphal procession. The public's adulation was boundless. Sacrifices were made in his name, and he was hailed as our star and our darling. His initial actions seemed to confirm all their hopes. He gave a moving funeral eulogy for Tiberius, while also traveling to the prison islands to personally retrieve the ashes of his mother and brother. He burned Tiberius's records of treason trials, abolished unpopular taxes, recalled exiles, and hosted extravagant gladiatorial games and chariot races for the public. He paid a massive bonus to the Praetorian Guard, securing their loyalty. For a few glorious months, it seemed Rome had entered a new golden age. The youth who had survived the darkness had brought the light. No one could have possibly imagined how quickly and how completely that light would be extinguished. The turning point, the moment that cleaved the reign of Caligula into a before and an after, came in October of 37 AD, just 7 months after he took the throne. He fell gravely ill. The nature of the sickness is lost to history. The sources speak only of a brain fever or a severe illness that brought him to the brink of death. The effect on the empire was immediate and profound. All of Rome was gripped by a panic-stricken grief. The public gathered in silent vigils outside the palace. People offered their own lives to the gods, if only the young emperor would be spared. The outpouring of devotion was a testament to the immense hope that had been invested in him. And then, against all odds, he recovered. But the man who emerged from his sickbed was not the same one who had entered it. Something inside him had irrevocably broken or been monstrously altered. The mask of the benevolent prince fell away, and the face of the monster, forged in the fires of Capri, was revealed. The first acts of the new Caligula were swift, shocking, and brutal. He turned first on those closest to him, those who represented potential threats to his now absolute and paranoid authority. Tiberius Gemellus, the grandson of the former emperor and Caligula's co-heir according to Tiberius's will, was the first to die. Caligula accused the boy of plotting against him and forced him to commit suicide. The charge was absurd. The real crime was Gemellus's lineage. Next was his father-in-law, Marcus Junius Silanus, a respected and influential senator. Caligula drove him to suicide with a relentless campaign of accusations and insults. Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had engineered Caligula's smooth succession, was also forced to kill himself and his wife. These were not the calculated purges of a typical autocrat securing his power. They were vicious, impulsive acts, as if the illness had burned away all restraint, all sense of gratitude or political calculation, leaving only a raw, predatory instinct. The adoring public was confused, but the Senate was terrified. They began to understand that the rules had changed. The hopeful dawn of the new reign was over. A long and terrifying night was beginning to fall. This descent was accelerated by another profound personal event, the death of his favorite sister, Drusilla, in 38 AD. Caligula's relationship with his sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Livilla, and Drusilla, was unusually and, according to his critics, unnaturally close. Rumors of incest had swirled, particularly concerning Drusilla. He had publicly taken her from her husband and lived with her as if she were his wife. When she died, his grief was theatrical and terrifying in its intensity. He declared a period of public mourning so absolute that to laugh, to bathe, or to dine with one's family was a capital crime. He then took the unprecedented step of having her posthumously deified by the Senate, making her the first Roman woman to be declared a goddess, Diva Drusilla. This act was more than just grief, it was a statement. If his sister could be a god, what did that make him? It was the first clear sign of a burgeoning megalomania that would soon consume him entirely. The personal loss seemed to sever his last tether to conventional human feeling, pushing him further into a world of his own making, a world where he was the only law and his whims were divine decrees. With his political rivals eliminated and his grief metastasizing into a god complex, Caligula's reign devolved into a systematic campaign of terror, extravagance, and humiliation. One of his first priorities was to bankrupt the state in the most spectacular fashion possible. The vast treasury left by the frugal Tiberius, estimated at over 2.5 billion sesterces, was squandered in less than a year. He staged gladiatorial games of unprecedented scale and cost. He showered the populace with gold and silver coins thrown from the rooftops of basilicas. But his most infamous project was the construction of a 2-mile-long floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, near Naples. He ordered hundreds of merchant ships to be seized, lined up side by side, and decked with a roadway. He then spent 2 days parading back and forth across this pointless bridge, once on horseback and once in a chariot, wearing what he claimed was the breastplate of Alexander the Great. The feat was meant to demonstrate his mastery over nature itself, to outdo the Persian king Xerxes' famous bridging of the Hellespont. In reality, it was a colossal logistical nightmare that crippled grain shipments to Rome and served no purpose other than to satisfy a fleeting, grandiose whim. Once the treasury was empty, Caligula turned to predation to fund his lifestyle. His methods were both cruel and grotesquely inventive. He revived the treason trials that Tiberius had made infamous, but with a terrifying new transparency. He declared that he was publishing Tiberius's old files, which he had once pretended to burn, and used them as a pretext to accuse wealthy senators and equestrians of disloyalty. The result was a foregone conclusion: execution and the confiscation of their entire estate by the emperor. He held auctions of palace property, including old gladiators and family heirlooms, and forced senators to attend and bid against each other, driving prices to absurd heights. One senator who dozed off during the bidding was declared by Caligula to have nodded his assent to a bid of 13 million sesterces for some minor items, and was forced to pay. He instituted a dizzying array of new taxes on lawsuits, on food sold in the city, on the wages of porters. In the most shocking move of all, he established a state-run brothel within the Palatine Palace itself, staffed by the wives and daughters of respectable senators and knights, with heralds sent out into the forum to invite men of all ages to come and enjoy themselves. The revenue went directly to the emperor's coffers. It was not just extortion, it was a deliberate act of degradation, a way of showing the Roman elite that he owned not just their property, but their honor and their families as well. This systematic humiliation of the aristocracy, particularly the Senate, became a central obsession. Caligula seemed to take a perverse delight in dismantling the dignity of the very institution that was, in theory, the bedrock of the Roman state. He treated the senators not as partners in governance, but as his personal slaves. He would make them run for miles in their togas beside his chariot. At his banquets, he would force some of the most distinguished men in Rome to wait on his table, dressed in the tunics of servants. He would randomly interrupt state business with fits of giggling, later explaining that he was amused by the thought that with a single word he could have all their throats cut. His contempt was bottomless. This campaign of psychological warfare reached its apotheosis in the famous story of his horse, Incitatus. The horse lived in a marble stable, had a jewel-studded collar, and was served oats mixed with gold flakes. Caligula would invite the horse to dine with him and, according to the historians, declared his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. Whether he was serious or not is almost irrelevant. The gesture itself was the point, a declaration that his horse was more worthy of honor than the entire Roman Senate. It was the ultimate expression of his power to invert the natural order, to render all of Rome's sacred traditions meaningless through sheer, absurd caprice. As his earthly power became absolute, Caligula's mind turned to the heavens. The deification of Drusilla was only the beginning. He began to see himself not merely as a ruler favored by the gods, but as a god himself, present on earth. At first, he would dress as minor deities like Bacchus or Hercules. Soon, he graduated to the major Olympians. He would appear in public dressed as Apollo, carrying a bow, or as Neptune, wielding a trident. His ultimate goal was to be worshipped as Jupiter Latiaris, the chief god of the Roman state. He had a special passageway built to connect his palace on the Palatine Hill with the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, so that he could, as he claimed, go and consult with his fellow deity. He would hold conversations with the temple statue, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting threats at it. He ordered a temple to be built to his own divinity in Rome and installed a life-sized, golden statue of himself within it, which was dressed each day in a replica of the clothes he was wearing. This delusion soon spilled beyond the borders of Rome with terrifying potential consequences. He ordered Petronius, the governor of Syria, to erect a colossal golden statue of himself inside the Holy of Holies of the temple in Jerusalem. This was an act of sacrilege so profound it would have undoubtedly sparked a massive, bloody revolt throughout the entire Jewish world. Petronius, understanding the cataclysm that would follow, courageously delayed the order, risking his own life by writing back to the emperor and pleading for him to reconsider. The Jewish leaders, including the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, sent a desperate embassy to Rome to beg the emperor to rescind the edict. Philo's account of their audience is a chilling portrait of a madman at play. Caligula received them while inspecting one of his villas, wandering from room to room, asking them bizarre questions like, "Why do you people refuse to eat pork?" while ignoring their pleas. He dismissed them with a casual, terrifying comment. "They seem to me to be men who are not so much wicked as unhappy and foolish in not believing that I have been given a divine nature." Only Caligula's timely death prevented this catastrophe, but the incident reveals the scale of his megalomania. His personal vanity had become a geopolitical threat capable of setting the entire East ablaze. The private life of the emperor became a mirror of his public tyranny. The palace, once the center of Roman governance, was transformed into a stage for his sadistic and insatiable appetites. The rumors of incest with all three of his sisters were rampant. Suetonius claims he caught them in the act on multiple occasions. He had a string of wives whom he married and divorced on a whim. He famously attended the wedding of one aristocrat, only to take the bride for himself, issue a proclamation that he had taken a wife in the manner of Romulus, and then discard her a few days later. His fourth and final wife, Milonia Caesonia, was neither young nor beautiful, but he was reportedly devoted to her in his own twisted way. He was said to love her so fiercely that he would often threaten to have her tortured to find out why he loved her so much. He would parade her naked before his friends, and, after the birth of their daughter, Julia Drusilla, he took the infant to the temple of Jupiter and placed her on the god's lap, declaring her to be Jupiter's child as well as his own. He reportedly delighted in the baby's savage nature, as she would try to scratch out the eyes of the other children she played with. His cruelty was not just political, it was personal and performative. He found exquisite pleasure in the suffering of others. He would have criminals and prisoners of war torn apart by wild animals in the arena during the lunch intermission, when most of the crowd had left, forcing those who remained to watch. He complained that his reign was not blessed by any great public disasters, like the Varian disaster under Augustus, and wished for a great military defeat, a famine, or a plague to make his era memorable. His most infamous saying, often quoted when he was with his lovers or at a banquet, encapsulated his philosophy of rule. Odorant, dumb, metuant, let them hate me. So long as they fear me, torture became a form of entertainment. He had a special technique where victims were killed by small, repeated blows. To make them feel that they were dying, he would stand by and give precise instructions to the executioners to prolong the agony. This was not the cold, calculated cruelty of a politician eliminating rivals. This was the hot, visceral sadism of a man who derived a deep, psychological satisfaction from the absolute domination and degradation of others. Perhaps nothing captures the bizarre fusion of megalomania, cruelty, and absurdity that defined Caligula's reign better than his so-called military campaigns. In 39 AD, he marched north with a massive army, supposedly to complete the conquest of Germany his father had begun. After crossing the Rhine, he engaged in a series of farcical maneuvers. He ordered a detachment of his own Germanic bodyguard to hide in a nearby forest, then staged a mock battle, leading a heroic charge to capture them. He then declared a great victory and berated the legions who had not participated for their cowardice. The charade was transparent to everyone. Then, in 40 AD, he marched this same army to the shores of the English Channel, announcing his intention to invade Britain. He had siege engines and artillery arrayed along the coast, as if preparing for a massive amphibious assault. The legions waited in formation. Then, at the last moment, Caligula gave a truly insane order. He commanded his soldiers to lay down their arms, take off their helmets, and fill them with seashells from a beach. These, he declared, were the spoils of the ocean, a tribute that the sea itself had paid to its conqueror. He then ordered the construction of a lighthouse to commemorate this victory. Historians have struggled to explain this episode. Was it a symptom of complete mental collapse? Or was it something more sinister, a calculated act of humiliation against the legions, some of whom had mutinied against his father years before? It was an assertion of power so absolute that it could command a Roman army to perform an act of utter, meaningless absurdity. He returned to Rome demanding a full triumph, not with British captives, but with tall Gauls he had hired and whose hair he had dyed to make them look like Germans. By late 40 AD, the terror had become unsustainable. The fear Caligula inspired had curdled into a desperate, silent resolve among a growing number of people that he had to be removed. He had alienated every powerful faction in the state. The Senate hated him for their humiliation and the murder of their colleagues. The aristocracy feared for their property and the honor of their families. Even the military, whose loyalty he had once commanded, was disgusted by the farce of the northern campaigns. The conspiracy that finally formed against him was not a noble plot to restore the Republic, but a desperate act of self-preservation. And fittingly, it came from within his own inner sanctum, from the very men paid to protect him, the Praetorian Guard. The ringleader was an officer named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea was a veteran soldier, a man of courage, but he had a high-pitched, effeminate voice, a fact that Caligula found endlessly amusing. For years, the emperor had tormented him with obscene and insulting passwords, such as Priapus or Venus, whenever Chaerea came on duty. This relentless, personal mockery, this daily degradation, pushed Chaerea beyond his breaking point. He found willing co-conspirators among other Praetorian officers, like Cornelius Sabinus, and a few senators who were brave or foolish enough to join. The final act of the tragedy was set for January of 41 AD, during the Palatine Games, a festival that Caligula himself had instituted. On the last day of the Games, January 24th, the conspirators put their plan into action. As Caligula was leaving the theater to go to lunch, he was diverted by a group of young noblemen from Asia who were to perform for him. He entered a secluded, underground passageway that connected the theater to the palace. This was the moment Chaerea had been waiting for. He approached the emperor from behind and asked for the password. Caligula, true to form, gave a mocking reply. Chaerea's response was a sword stroke. He cried out, "Take this!" and slashed the emperor across the neck and jaw. Caligula stumbled, wounded but still alive. Then Cornelius Sabinus struck him from the front, bringing him to his knees. The other conspirators, a mix of guards and senators, swarmed in. All the pent-up rage and terror of the past 4 years was unleashed in a frenzy of violence. They descended upon the fallen emperor like wolves, stabbing him again and again, shouting at him to feel each blow. Suetonius records that he was stabbed over 30 times, with one conspirator even carving off and eating a piece of his flesh. The man who had made others feel that they were dying was given the same lesson in his final, agonizing moments. His last words were reportedly a weak cry of, "I am still alive," before the final, merciful blow was struck. The assassination of the emperor did not bring order, but chaos. The moment the news spread, Caligula's loyal Germanic bodyguard, enraged and panicked, drew their swords and went on a rampage through the palace. They cut down anyone in their path, conspirators, innocent senators who had come to the games, ushers, and bystanders. The palace ran with blood. In the midst of this pandemonium, the assassins sought to complete their work by extinguishing Caligula's line. A centurion was dispatched to the imperial apartments where he found Caligula's wife, Caesonia, weeping over her husband's body. He killed her without ceremony. Their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, just a year old, was snatched from her nurse's arms and her head was smashed against a wall. It was an act of brutal, cold-blooded necessity in their eyes, ensuring no heir would survive to become a rallying point for revenge. For a few hours, it seemed the entire imperial system might collapse. While the German guard rampaged, the Senate convened on the Capitoline Hill and began to debate the restoration of the Republic. Orators gave passionate speeches about liberty and the end of tyranny. They passed a decree of damnatio memoriae, ordering that Caligula's name be erased from all public records and his statues be torn down. But their debate was a fantasy. They had misjudged the new reality of Roman power. The true kingmakers were no longer the senators in their togas, but the soldiers with their swords. While the Senate talked, the Praetorian Guard acted. Scouring the palace for loot and potential rivals, a group of guardsmen discovered a figure hiding behind a curtain, trembling in fear. It was Claudius, Caligula's 50-year-old uncle, a man long considered a harmless fool due to a limp, a stammer, and other physical infirmities. The guards, recognizing him, spontaneously lifted him onto their shoulders and proclaimed him the new emperor. They carried him back to their camp, and the next day, faced with the armed might of the Praetorians, the Senate had no choice but to ratify their decision. The brief dream of a restored republic was over. Claudius's first major act was to dispense justice for the murder of his predecessor. Though he likely felt no love for his terrifying nephew, he understood that the precedent of emperors being assassinated by their own guards could not be allowed to stand. Cassius Chaerea, Cornelius Sabinus, and a few of the other key conspirators were arrested and executed. Chaerea reportedly met his end with dignity, asking for the same sword he had used to strike the first blow. Caligula's body, which had been left in the bloody passage for hours, was secretly taken by his friends, partially cremated on a makeshift pyre, and buried in a shallow grave on his private estate. It was only later, when his sisters returned from exile, that his remains were exhumed and given a proper cremation and burial. The reign of terror was over, but the machinery of absolute power, now firmly in the hands of the military, remained fully intact. Was the ultimate legacy of Caligula. For centuries, his name has been synonymous with the absolute corruption of absolute power. But historians continue to debate the source of his monstrous behavior. Were the accounts of writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both members of the senatorial class that Caligula so viciously terrorized, exaggerated for dramatic effect? Almost certainly. They wrote decades after his death, compiling every rumor and piece of hostile propaganda into a seamless narrative of insanity. Some modern scholars have attempted retrospective medical diagnoses, suggesting his brain fever could have been a condition like encephalitis or temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause profound personality changes and psychotic behavior. Others point to the possibility of lead poisoning from water pipes or wine goblets. These theories are intriguing, but ultimately unprovable. Yet, to focus solely on a potential medical cause is perhaps to miss the more profound and disturbing lesson of his reign. Whether driven by illness, deep-seated psychological trauma from his childhood, or simply an inherent malice given free rein, Caligula's actions followed a terrifying logic. He did not simply rule. He performed a 4-year-long piece of political theater designed to demonstrate one thing: that his will was limitless. He systematically attacked every pillar of Roman society: the Senate's dignity, the treasury's stability, religious tradition, military discipline, and basic moral decency. He was not just an emperor. He was a deconstructionist, tearing down the values of his world to prove that he stood above them all. His reign exposed the terrifying fragility of a system that placed the lives of millions in the hands of a single, unchecked individual. In the end, Caligula stands as more than just a figure of history. He is an archetype. He is the specter that haunts every seat of immense power, a permanent reminder of the abyss that lies on the other side of accountability. His story is a grotesque masterpiece of human tragedy, demonstrating how a beloved savior could, in the blink of an eye, become a deranged god-king demanding worship one moment and ordering his soldiers to gather seashells the next. He forced Rome to look into the face of chaos, to see its most sacred institutions rendered meaningless by the whim of one man. And though his reign was mercifully short, the shadow of the little boot looms long, a chilling and eternal testament to the fact that the worst monsters are not those that hide in the dark, but those who are given a throne and invited to rule in the light.